Hello, thank you for having me. I came here mainly to see the kangaroos, but I'm also here to talk to you about cannabis and cancer. So unlike the previous speakers, I am not a doctor or formal researcher, but I have been involved in the cannabis extract movement for the past almost 7 years. I've spoken with hundreds of patients who've used extracts for cancers and other diseases, and have 2 close family friends who I watched start to finish have amazing success with their cancers. So I'm just going to go through the information, and I think it'll be very helpful. So this presentation is split up. I'm going to speak initially about the scientific literature showing how cannabinoids fight cancer. It's been alluded to a little bit, but I'm going to talk about a few cancers specifically. I'll talk about a few case studies of people who are very close to me and I've known for years who've had amazing success. And I'll talk about statements from caregivers who've worked with many patients and the observations that they've seen. And I'll conclude with the limits of the medicine because it's not perfect. We have a lot more to learn, and there's other things that are needed to make it work most effectively. So there's only 2 things that I'm formally asking for here. Terminal cancer patients should have access to this medicine, any terminal cancer patients. There's a very good chance that their lives could be saved with this medicine, or at the very least, their pain drastically mitigated. And there also needs to be clinical trials so that we can determine the best ways to use the medicine and learn more about its potential and limits. So to understand how cannabis can work in humans, it's critical to understand the endocannabinoid system. So this is the chemical messaging system that maintains homeostasis in the body through the interaction between our endocannabinoids, primarily anandamide and 2-AG, and the cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2. So these endocannabinoids are very similar in their chemical structures to the phytocannabinoids in the cannabis plant. So THC and CBD are very structurally similar and exert similar properties as these endocannabinoids. So for the mechanisms of how it works against cancer, it's a multifaceted approach. The most potent method is directly inducing apoptosis, which is programmed cell death in the cancer cells. In a multicellular organism, single cells have the intrinsic capability to undergo cell death when they become old or damaged because this benefits the organism as a whole. However, with cancer, the cells lose the ability to undergo apoptosis, and cannabinoids have the ability to restore this function. They also inhibit the reproduction of cancer cells. They stop the formation of blood vessels to tumors, which is a critical step in the growth of many tumors, and they stop the spread and invasion of cancers into other tissues. And this is done through both the activation of the traditional cannabinoid receptors and through receptor-independent mechanisms. So I'm just going to go into a few cancers here. So THC, all the references are at the bottom and at the end of the presentation, has been found to directly kill glioma, astrocytoma, and neuroblastoma cells. These are all very aggressive brain cancers, and it also inhibits the formation of blood vessels and invasion of the cancer cells into other tissues. CBD has also been found to be very effective against brain cancer, and I'll talk a little more about how they work best together against the cancer. So this is being taken very seriously at the highest levels. In fact, just less than 2 months ago, the Food and Drug Administration, which is the top dog in the United States for approving drugs, granted orphan drug designation to a pharmaceutical CBD product for directly treating glioma. And orphan drugs, or that designation, is given to drugs that are intended to treat conditions affecting 200,000 or less people. But there needs to be plausible scientific evidence that it could work in humans and that it's safe. So the fact that the FDA approved this is basically a tacit admission by the United States government that a cannabinoid can fight cancer in humans. And another corporation, GW Pharmaceuticals, they produce Sativex, which is one of the most widely used prescription medicines in the world, although I believe that other more whole plant or more full spectrum compounds work better. But they've invested a significant amount of money into research in cannabinoids and cancer and hold a patent on using THC and CBD together to directly fight cancer, not the side effects, but directly the cancer itself. So moving on to breast cancer, which has been found to be very susceptible to THC and CBD. So what this graph is showing is 3 different conditions. There's the vehicle or control-treated mice not given anything, but they have cancer cells implanted into into their bodies and they reproduce and form tumors. And the THC and JWH133 mice have drastically reduced tumors compared to the vehicle. And so JWH133 is a synthetic cannabinoid that only activates the CB2 receptor. So it's made in the lab, only activates CB2. And what this is showing is that the anti-cancer effects in this case are mediated by the CB2 receptor. And the next cancers I'm going to talk about are also mediated by CB2, but it's not only that. Sometimes CB1, sometimes other receptors, sometimes receptor independent. So very diverse effects. This is a study of 4 different pancreatic cancer cell lines. So the way these studies work is they'll take cell cultures, which have, they're basically thousands of cells with the same genetics, and they're given names to differentiate them from one another. And THC has been found to kill 4 different types of pancreatic cancer cells. And then again, in the animal studies, it is found both the THC and the synthetic cannabinoid are found to reduce the cancer. And then moving on to liver cancer, basically, the black bars in the treatment parts are what's most relevant. THC has been found to be very effective against 2 different types of liver cancer, again through the CB2 receptor. And again, I think you're starting to see a trend here that the natural cannabinoid and synthetic cannabinoid are very effective against reducing the tumors when used in a living animal. And then there's leukemia, has been found to be very susceptible to CBD at a very low concentration. This is basically just a few milligrams, has been found to abolish 2 different types of leukemic cancer cells. And this is actually one of the few conditions where there is a report in the literature of a human patient using cannabis extract for the cancer. So there was a November 2013 Case Reports in Oncology study which found, it tracked a 14-year-old female who had an especially aggressive form of terminal acute lymphoblastic leukemia who was used cannabis extracts as a last resort after almost 3 years of chemotherapy and radiation failed. So the doctors tracked her cancer cell count every day using the extracts, and there was an immediate drop just within a few days of beginning the extract treatment. So because of this, the doctors were able to exclude even spontaneous remission as a cause of the regression because of this dose-response curve, and because of the blood test, they were able to determine there were no chemotherapeutic agents in the blood, and cannabis extracts were the sole treatment. Unfortunately, in this case, the patient still passed away, but the doctors determined that this was from the side effects of the chemotherapy. It had caused a gastrointestinal perforation, which is common for many people receiving high doses of chemotherapy, which, as we all know, kills healthy cells and cancerous cells, whereas with cannabinoids, the studies have found that the anti-cancer effects are selective. So when they're administered to healthy cells, they don't kill healthy cells and only kill cancer cells. So that's the hallmark of an ideal chemotherapeutic drug is selectivity, and that is what we're seeing. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's basically been found that cannabinoids kill or inhibit virtually all major cancers. I've actually learned of many new types of cancers just because of reading how cannabinoids stop them. And one thing I want to point out on this slide is that CBD has been found to kill multiple myeloma cells, which is a very aggressive, rare form of a white blood cell cancer, by itself or in synergy with chemotherapy, because cannabis extracts, as of now, are best used alongside chemotherapy. I'll be talking about a lot of people who didn't use it, but it is prudent to combine chemotherapy with the cannabinoids because they work together, and obviously the traditional treatments have much more research behind them. And I really want to point out the importance of synergy. In traditional pharmaceuticals, isolated drugs are the standard, but that's not the case with cannabis. Studies have found that when you use whole plant extracts with the full spectrum of cannabinoids, it works better. And the study I have here about THC and CBD inhibiting glioblastomas is a few years old, but there was a study that came out just last week finding that the same thing, and that the THC and CBD treatments prime the cancer cells for radiation, so it makes radiation work better. So cannabinoids can be integrated with traditional treatments to work better. So this is all well and good that all these studies are showing that cannabinoids fight cancer in us, but why would it work in humans? And the answer is endocannabinoids. Zach Klein was talking about anandamide and 2-AG, which Dr. Meshulam discovered, and these have been found to kill cancer cells through the same and very similar mechanisms as phytocannabinoids. So right now, you all have endocannabinoids in your bodies that are helping stop cancer, not even considering the phytocannabinoids. So I have a study here, anandamide can kill stomach cancer cells, and like the phytocannabinoids, works together with chemotherapy to stop cancer. And just like the phytocannabinoids, the effects are concentration dependent. This is a study with neuroblastoma and lymphoma cells, finding that as you increase concentrations of anandamide, there is a dramatic increase in the apoptotic rate. And then going even further, it seems that we are programmed to have cannabinoids kill cancer cells because studies that have, including the pancreatic cancer and breast cancer studies I mentioned, have found that the cancerous tissues have much higher expression levels of cannabinoid receptors than healthy cells. So given that endocannabinoids also kill cancer, it makes perfect sense that this is a defense mechanism. If healthy cells are programmed to develop more cannabinoid receptors, when they become cancerous, they would be more susceptible to the apoptosis-inducing effects of endocannabinoids and help it stop from getting out of control. And phytocannabinoids simply work through this already existing system within us to kill cancer. And then here's just one more study that found that people with higher expression levels of cannabinoid receptors, or with people with liver cancer, had significantly better disease-free survival than people with lower expression levels. So although we all have endocannabinoid systems, our systems are not created equal, as the study clearly implies. Some people have higher expression levels of receptors and some lower levels, and the people who have better endocannabinoid systems survive cancer better. And this is just one summarizing study from just last year in the journal Progress in Lipid Research that, when reviewing the evidence, found that cannabinoids and endocannabinoids are pro-apoptotic in most cancers. I had to cut a lot of stuff out of this presentation. It was pretty long before, but that summarizes it. It does work against most cancers. So as I said, I've been involved in this for nearly 7 years, and it's only recently that I've come to understand the science much better. Understanding the endocannabinoid system and the studies makes the human results that I've been hearing about make perfect sense. So I'm going to talk about a few cases, including one of the close family friends that I have, and you can see it working in humans. So first, there's Stan Rutner. I actually just got to meet him on November 1st at the United Patients Group conference in California. United Patients Group is an organization in the United States that is extremely helpful to patients, connecting them with legal access to cannabis medicines, and it was started because of Stan's experience. So he had lung cancer diagnosed in early 2011, which had metastasized to his brain. He attempted chemotherapy and radiation, which failed. So he was moved to hospice and given just weeks to live. And it was at this point that his son-in-law, John Malanka, suggested cannabis just as a means of palliative care to help with the pain. But it was quickly found that it was doing more than that. He was able to give up his supplemental oxygen within 2 weeks. And in 6 months, he added a high THC oil to have more potent anti-cancer effects, as well as a high CBD oil. These were provided by Mara Gordon, who will be speaking tomorrow about pediatric cancers. And by January 2013, he had no more cancer in his brain or lungs. And I just... Yeah, there's going to be a couple cases like this, so it's nice. So moving on, Dennis Hill, he was my aunt's meditation teacher, so that's how I got connected with him. He was diagnosed with metastasized prostate cancer in February 2010 and actually has a background in biochemistry and was in cancer research for 10 years. He was acutely aware of the side effects of his potential chemotherapy treatments and simply wanted another way. So we talked about the cannabis treatments, he looked into it and made his decision that he wanted to try it. So he initially wasn't able to get full-strength cannabis oil, which has higher concentrations of the phytocannabinoids, but he was using a weaker extract in the form of cannabis butter, and that was enough to eliminate the primary tumor. But once he was able to get the full-strength cannabis oil, that also eliminated the metastatic areas. And I actually have his documentation here. So that's the biopsy showing the 6 sites that they took showing the cancer, and then here is the resolution of no cancer. He did have 3 injections of Lupron, which is a testosterone inhibitor. Testosterone is known to feed prostate cancer. So Lupron doesn't directly kill cancer cells, but it can slow the growth. So I'm sure that that certainly helped with his dramatic results, but the cannabis extracts was the main form of cancer-killing medication that he used. And he actually had a brief recurrence of his cancer. He wasn't taking a very strong maintenance dose, which is often very necessary to stay in remission, especially when you have aggressive or genetically driven cancers, as Dennis did. But he simply restarted the therapy, and within 3 months, his PSA had returned to normal. And so for his maintenance dose, he uses 200 milligrams a day of a cannabis oil with equal concentrations of THC and CBD, and during his treatment was using 1 gram a day of the cannabis oil. Then moving on to Corey Yelland, one of the most colorful and awesome characters in the cannabis extract movement. So she was diagnosed with anal canal cancer in July 2011, and surgery removed a lot of it, but there was still some, deeper in, and she also had 2 skin cancer spots on her collarbone. So radiation was proposed to eliminate it, but she denied the therapy because of very terrible potential side effects that I don't really even feel comfortable repeating, but I'm sure you can imagine what can happen radiating an area like that. So she learned of cannabis oil as a potential treatment and began using it for both cancers. Within just over a week, she had eliminated the 2 spots of skin cancer with topical application, and using orally ingested cannabis oil and suppositories, she was able to eliminate the anal canal cancer. Just like with skin cancers, when you can get the cannabinoids actually touching the cancer, then it's much more potent, so that dual mechanism was effective. And there she is standing with Dr. Raphael Meshulam, who you just saw a lot of. So she gets around and is very, has helped many people have great success with the oils. And the last case I'm going to talk about the last individual case is Joanne Crowther, who was diagnosed with large B-cell lymphoma in 2009 that had metastasized to her brain in March 2010. And she eliminated that only with chemotherapy and radiation. Didn't use any cannabis whatsoever with that first bout. However, it returned in November 2011 with some other metastatic areas. She used cannabis extract, used chemotherapy again, but had to discontinue it within just a couple months because of complications with her liver. Not being able to do the chemotherapy, she was sent home on palliative care and began taking cannabis oil as a last resort. By July 2012, a lymphoma mass in her left thigh had regressed, and by September 24th, she was noted in complete remission. And I have her documentation and Corey Yelland's in a free report I have, cannabisextractreport.com, and her doctor actually remarked that she had made a miraculous recovery with stable clinical condition. That's his words, not mine, although I do believe it is quite miraculous. So moving on to doctors, who obviously are the most respected people in the medical profession, they're also observing these effects. I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Hergenrather at a couple CME-accredited conferences, so this is where doctors go to get continuing medical education credit so that they can keep their licenses, and he is accredited to speak to them. So the first thing his first observations is not all tumors are sensitive to cannabinoids. There's a couple that don't appear to respond, but I have heard of several. He says that he's seen lung cancers be resistant, but I've known of several lung cancer cases, and I actually have a surprise addition to my presentation. There's a woman here, Sharon Kelly. I learned of her story earlier this month, and she had terminal lung cancer, was given 6 to 9 months to live, and by September 3rd, 2014, had eliminated the cancer entirely. And she's literally right there. Like, this is not just, this is happening in front of us. So it's as real as it gets. But so more importantly, what he's seeing is that most cancers do respond. I don't need to read all these, but he's seeing that it works against most forms of cancer. And given that that's what the studies show, they kill virtually all forms of cancer, they work through our endocannabinoid systems, this is just what would be expected from the science. It's not surprising at all. And here he is talking about a case in O'Shaughnessy's journal, which is one of the top cannabis journals in America. This is an optic pathway glioma that was treated only with cannabis oil that over a 16-month period regressed 95%. In this case, there was an associated cyst, which is that black thing. It's non-cancerous, but in this case, the cannabis extracts had no effect on that, but the glioma itself was dramatically reduced. And I know of at least one case where the cyst was also affected with cannabis oil. So that can be a work too in some cases. And he's working with an Australian right now, 16-year-old Lindsay Carter. I believe either he or his mother will actually be speaking here tomorrow. And he's been traveling to the United States for treatment for his brain tumor with cannabis extracts. The last 3 times he went over, every time he went, he had dramatic reduction in his brain tumor. There was a clear dose response. However, when he came back to Australia, he had not completely eliminated the tumor and it started to grow again. As amazing as cannabis oil is, it's not magic. If you stop taking it, it's not going to keep killing the cancer, and the cancers will start to reproliferate again. And Dr. Hergenrather notes that it's unethical, and I think evil, to keep this medicine away from people who it can save their lives and drastically eliminate their pain. And Lindsay is forced to be a refugee in America because of this, which I think is a crime. Australia is such a better country than America. You're making him come over here for this. It's messed up. So moving on to Dr. Alan Frankel, he was one of the sponsors of the United Patients Group conference that I recently attended, and in an article he states how he has seen tumors virtually disappear in some of his patients using no other therapy except relatively or very small doses of cannabinoids. Usually it takes more, but in some older people, even these small amounts can be very effective. He's also seen tumors shrinking and metastases disappearing, and one thing he said I'd never heard of before, he said sometimes the cancer will disappear in one place, reappear in another place, and then disappear again. So I don't know what's going on with that, but that's just what he said. And then the last doctor, Dr. Ephraim Lansky, I found this guy through interesting means. I was looking up information about Zach Klein, who just presented before me, and he was in an article with this guy, Dr. Ephraim Lansky, and it was talking about how Dr. Lansky treated a patient with a large tumor in his head with 1 gram a day of high CBD oil, and within 8 months the tumor had shrunk by 75%. It was not apparent whether the patient was also using, or the article didn't state whether the patient was also using traditional treatments, but it was strongly implied that these results were not expected. And there he is with a pomegranate flower. He does a lot of research into pomegranates. Very, very tasty, especially the seeds. So then I'd like to talk about just a few caregivers. Shamanic Healing is an organization that I'm very close with. I know one of the patients who had dramatic success with his extracts, and he really emphasizes the integration of cannabis and nutrition. Nutrition is often very critical to cannabis extracts working well against cancers because it works through our endocannabinoid systems. If our endocannabinoid systems are damaged, then the medicine will not work as well. For example, there's a study that found that people who had very low levels of omega-3 had virtually abolished neuronal communications within the endocannabinoid system. So you need nutrition, and that's what facilitates its effectiveness. So here's his statement they provided me. He's helped dozens of cancer patients into remission using the medicine. Very few of them have used chemotherapy or radiation concurrently. Some of them, the traditional treatments haven't worked for, or they made the decisions not to use it. And like I said, it's very prudent to combine traditional treatments with the extracts, but there are some people who choose to use it alone, and that's something that we need to respect. And I actually want to, he's only lost 2 patients. I want to read one of his statement about one of the patients he lost, because even when it doesn't save the patient's life, the effects that it has for the quality of life and their last moments is just so important. So here's one of the patients he lost. She was in her late 70s, a very aggressive form of cancer. Before the extract, she couldn't function. Mobility was near non-existent, and she was being taken care of by hospice for 2 or 3 months. The oil only gave her shy of 3 more months to live, but what it really did was reanimate her. She began telling stories from when she grew up and could finally leave her legacy to her grandchildren and children. She was her old self once again and in no more pain. Those last months where she was wholly there meant the world to her family members, as they told me. And I've heard several cases like that, even when patients are, treating their parents or elderly family members, and it doesn't work. It still so drastically alleviates the pain and makes them more with it. Instead of dying in pain or being doped up on morphine, unable to communicate and in a daze, they're actually able to go out with dignity. And I think that's personally just as important as saving the life, to be able to die the right way. So next is Epsilon Apothecaries. It's headed by a great guy named Dave Mapes, who's known for producing a guide that helps people make their own extracts, including THCA formulas. I just want to talk a moment about that because he was talking about the benefits of juicing. So in the raw cannabis plant, the cannabinoids are in their acidic forms. So THC is THCA, CBD is CBDA, and THCA is completely non-psychoactive. It's only when you heat the plant and you lose that carboxyl acid group that it becomes psychoactive. And there's many patients in this country who are using THCA tinctures for rare forms of epilepsy that don't respond at all traditional treatments. One in particular, Tara O'Connell, had Dravet syndrome. She was basically on the verge of death, and using THCA tincture has now been seizure-free for, I believe, 2 years. And so juicing is a very effective way to flood the body with these non-psychoactive raw cannabinoids, and I believe it is very effective against cancer and especially for preventing illnesses. And because these cannabinoids are also anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective, it's really, just like a vitamin. It's just generally good for you and provides no psychoactivity. And here's the statement Dave provided me about their success rates. And he differentiates between remission and cancer-free. Sometimes the doctor pronounces the patient in remission, even though there's some cancer left that is no longer life-threatening. And again, most of his patients have not used chemotherapy concurrently. And especially with the non-malignant tumors that haven't spread, very effective successes, I believe, because the cannabinoids can essentially focus their anti-cancer effects on that one site. And then the last organization I'm going to speak about is Harborside Health Center. This is the largest dispensary in the United States and possibly the largest in the world. And you would expect that if cannabis was actually fighting cancer in humans, that the largest dispensary would be reporting these results, and indeed they are. The owner, Stephen DeAngelo, appears in the trailer for the documentary Run from the Cure 2, stating that he has skin cancer patients coming in every week who are using the oil and it's stopping the growth of their skin cancers. I'm sure he's seen more than that. That's just what he's seen in the trailer, but it's very effective against skin cancer. And that picture there is not from Harborside, but it's a melanoma being treated topically with the oil very effectively. And in my report, I have like a dozen skin cancer successes alone. It just works really well against that. So then the limits, as Dr. Hergenrather and some studies show, there are some cancers and some people that seem to be resistant. I've known people who've taken hundreds of grams of cannabis oil and it seems to have been effective against stopping the growth of the cancer, but it doesn't regress. So more research is needed to find out more about these limits, and nutritional changes are often extremely important to making it work well. Cannabis oil alone is not as effective as when you eat well and you remove the foods that cause the cancer in the first place. And although the studies have showed that the anti-cancer effects are concentration dependent and usually increasing the doses is necessary, there are cases where more is not always better and lower doses are more effective. So cannabis extracts alone are not the answer to ending cancer. They are not the cure for cancer. Together with nutrition, exercise, meditation, traditional treatments like chemotherapy and radiation, they are an integrative role for fighting cancer. And then last of the limits, maintenance dosing is often critical to sustaining a remission. There's some people who do stay in remission not taking the extracts, but once you've had cancer, there's a very good chance that it can return. And even with traditional chemotherapy, there's what's known as maintenance chemotherapy to make sure that any residual cancer cells don't start to reproliferate. And of course, there's relatively little formal research. Like Dr. Meshulam said, there are no clinical trials of whole cannabis extracts in humans. But it's so clear, there's no doubt, it's 100% certain that it is killing cancer in humans. I've been in this for 7 years, seen it in 2 family friends. You just saw a lot of evidence. There's someone right here, like it's so clearly working. So just to summarize, phytocannabinoids and endocannabinoids have been found to be effective against virtually all the major cancers, and our bodies seem programmed to have the cannabinoids kill cancer cells because of the effectiveness of endocannabinoids and the fact that the cancerous tissues exhibit higher expression levels of the receptors. And with the brain trauma, that's a very similar phenomenon. When you have a brain injury, there's an upregulation of cannabinoid receptors and endocannabinoids to protect the brain. It's the same property with cancer. There's an upregulation of the receptors as a way to make it more susceptible to cannabinoids. And it's not just, individuals, doctors, caregivers, and corporations around the world have been observing these remarkable anti-cancer effects. So what do? It's very simple. All terminal cancer patients, if they want to use this medicine, should have access to it because it could save their lives or make their passings much better. And there also needs to be immediate clinical trials to determine the optimal ways to use this medicine. Just ways to make it work better. And skin cancer or terminal cancers, great place to start. With skin cancer, you can see the results very quickly with non-psychoactive topical application. And with terminal cancers, the patients have nothing to lose. So it just, there's a very clear path forward. It's just a matter of doing it. I know basically everyone is calling for these two things. The only thing I'm saying is we need to accelerate it. This is a very urgent issue. We cannot wait. People are dying every single day, and there's just no reason to wait. So that's about it. These are all the references. These are all peer-reviewed scientific studies, showing how the cannabinoids fight cancer. So yeah, that's it.